My father-in-law is in prison for trying to kill me. Now I know he was trying to be kind. 1 year ago, my father-in-law tried to murder me. He planned it beautifully, the trip up to the cabin in the woods that his family owned, pushing me into the dried-up old well, pickpocketed my phone, left a gun within the well that gave me the option of killing myself instead of starving to death. His twisted version of mercy, I guess. Either way, he would have got away with it. He hadn't accounted for the lost dog, though. Hadn't thought that a couple would come looking for a beloved pet who had raced off after a deer. That they would find me, half dead from starvation and dehydration, holding the gun, contemplating it seriously after nearly 3 days in the well, fully aware that I was going to die of thirst before starvation. There had been no rain for days. When I woke up in hospital, my wife Samantha was by my side holding my hand, her beautiful face wet with tears. Despite my own physical pain, all I wanted to do was make her stop crying. So I softly took her hand and with great effort raised it to my lips and gave it a gentle kiss. "I was so worried about you. What happened to you?" She begged me, green eyes bright with tears. The nurse came in and took my vitals, then told my wife that she should leave me to sleep some more. I was glad for the rescue because I knew once I revealed what had really happened to me, my wife's heart would break permanently. Her father had always been her favorite person. I met Samantha at work 3 years ago. She was the marketing executive where I was a software developer. We were both in our late 20s, and I knew within 10 minutes of our first conversation that I was going to marry her. She was bright, funny, clever, and it didn't hurt that she was absolutely gorgeous with bright green eyes and long red hair. 4 months into dating her, she met my family. I come from a massive family where both my parents had 4 siblings each and then went on to have 5 kids together too. Our Sunday lunches are loud, raucous events at my folks' place with at least 20 people in attendance, but Sam was utterly charmed by my family, and my parents and siblings adored her. She fit right in like the missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle. Everything was going so well until Sam decided it was time for me to meet her only family member, her father. Cameron Joyce was a tall, burly man who dressed and looked like a lumberjack. He lived in a neighborhood at the very edge of the suburbs, close to a big, wide forest. When he stiffly shook my hand, his blue eyes ice cold, a sort of chill ran through me. After we walked into the 2-bedroom house behind him, the first red flag should have been that there were no photos of Sam's mother. Not one. In fact, if I truly thought about it, Sam never really spoke about her mother. I should have asked more questions about her, but I guess I always just assumed that the subject was too painful for her. The first time I thought her father was trying to kill me was a fleeting thought which happened that visit. I distinctly heard Sam tell her father over the phone multiple times that I had a nut allergy, but when we sat down to eat, I started to feel my throat swell up. Sam's father watched me cough, slowly chewing his food. Of course, we had an EpiPen on us, but if we hadn't, I could be dead right now. Then it was the time right after our wedding when he knew I couldn't swim, but I am 90% sure he pushed me into the lake when the 3 of us were on the docks looking at his boat. The third time was the charm, though. If those hikers hadn't found me, I'm sure I would have died down in that well. You might be wondering why I chose to go to that cabin with a man I thought was trying to kill me. Because I really didn't think he was trying to kill me. My brain insisted that I had misread or misheard the situation, and both those incidents could have been accidents. Also, Sam was keen her father and her husband, and I just couldn't break her heart. I'll never forget the ride to go to the cabin. My father-in-law was a man of few words, so when he decided to tell me a story, I almost sighed with relief that I didn't have to keep talking to fill the dead air between us. He kept his eyes on the road and said, "There was once a boy who lived a happy life with his family in the forest. It was him, his 3 brothers, his parents, his grandparents, his uncles and aunts, and all his cousins. He didn't know much about the world beyond his family home, but he had 1,000 things to do in the woods, so he never wondered. For a time, all was well, and as it should be, the boy and his family lived off the land, hunted, and thrived. Until one day on his 19th birthday, the boy saw the woman in white in the gut of the trees. Ethereal and shimmering, she glowed like a white will-o'-the-wisp. When he asked his mother about her, she told him to stay away from the woman, that nothing good comes out of the woods on a sickle moon night. We were close to the cabin now, and as we approached it, a strange sort of feeling was beginning to crawl up my spine, a sense of something being wrong gripping me tightly. He then continued the story. The boy listened to his mother. 2 days he did not go looking for the woman. On the third night, he found himself outside the house walking into the woods. As he drew closer, he saw the woman's face. Her gold hair shimmered all the way to her knees, ice blue eyes and a lovely face that glowed with the promise of a forever. His mortal brain didn't understand. The woman offered him her hand. Entranced, he reached out and took it. He parked and turned off the engine of the car, but still wouldn't look at me instead. He stared ahead into the depth of the forest as he told me this eerie tale. The minute he took that hand, the thing claimed him. They found him a year later at the top of a mountain, living in a cave, naked and insane, speaking a strange tongue in a language which had to be made up. What was terrifying was that both his legs from his knees downwards were gone. And yet, the wounds had been cauterized, and someone or something had clearly been feeding him. His parents brought him home and tried to help him recover his mind. The doctors fitted him with prosthetic legs he kept hidden away. But the boy was never really the same again. When he began to slowly speak again, he spoke of a woman with a skull instead of a face, a long, skeletal crone's body, fangs instead of teeth, clumps of white hair that fell out of her head, and milk-white eyes, the eyes of a corpse. And then, finally, the ear-piercing scream. He fell silent then, and my skin crawling, I asked him, what happened to him? My father-in-law broke out of his trance and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Let me show you how to hunt," he said. The trial was short. My father-in-law was caught in possession of my phone and several other items that suggested what he planned to do. His internet search history revealed extensive ways to murder someone. When they put Cameron Joyce in prison, my wife cried herself to sleep every night for a month. I think she blamed me for what happened, even though she would never say those words. I would catch her looking out from our apartment in the direction of the forest, which we could see clearly. She grew more and more forgetful, wouldn't go to work, would sleep all day. Some days she wouldn't even brush her hair. Her face grew more haggard, and sometimes when I saw her naked form in bed in the moonlight, I could swear I saw her ribs through her translucent skin. Her sadness was going to devour her, and there was nothing I could do about it. One day I came home and she wasn't there. I looked for her everywhere. I don't know how I knew it, but somehow I knew she would be at the cabin. I jumped into my car and sped there at full speed, not caring how many fines I would have to pay. I got there just before dark and I caught sight of her. She was naked, her back to me facing the forest. "Sam!" I yelled her name as I got out of the car. She didn't turn to look at me. Instead, she stood there, her messy red hair lifted by the breeze. "Sam!" I yelled to her again, a deep sense of unease in my bones. Slowly, she turned to face me, and that was when I saw her face, a skull, a distended jaw that opened much, much too wide. That was when she let out an ear-piercing scream. A sharp pain burst through my head, and I immediately clapped my hands over my ears. I tried screaming my wife's name again, but all I could hear was the shriek that was starting to feel like someone was knifing my brain. My vision swam, and I stumbled backward. A dozen figures had appeared from the woods, all of them with skull-like faces, impossibly distended jaws, and the same milk-white eyes that had replaced my wife's bright green ones. And they were all walking towards me. I didn't even think. I got into my car and started the engine, my ears bleeding from the sound of the scream. I ran. 2 days later, I am couch surfing at a friend's after the doctors had dealt with one perforated eardrum. They told me I was lucky, both my eardrums hadn't burst from the volume I was listening to music at, which I used as a cheap excuse. Nobody would believe me in what I saw. They would lock me up and think I was going crazy. I had just nodded and let the doctors get on with it. There was a ringing in my ears I couldn't quite get rid of no matter how I tried. There was no way I could explain what had happened in those woods to them. I am waiting for the ringing and the headache to stop before I go looking for Sam again. This time, I will take a gun. I'll find her and bring her home. I've already spoken to the police, but I know they just aren't as motivated to find her as me. My phone rings, and I gingerly held it to my good ear. It's a collect call from the prison. I accept it because who else could possibly give me answers? It happened, didn't it? My father-in-law's gruff voice made me nearly drop the phone. I swallowed hard. Sam's gone, I said numbly. She's gone back where she belongs, he said. You're lucky. How am I lucky? I asked, bitter anger surging through me. She was my wife and your daughter. That thing was no daughter nor a wife. It knows how to mimic being human. Why do you think I told you that story? His voice was low and even. My jaw dropped. Was he really suggesting he was the boy from the dark fairy tale he has told? You're cruel. Disowning your daughter, trying to kill me. You should probably reconsider your life, old man. He then suddenly interrupted me and said, Listen to me, boy, and listen good. That creature was dropped at my doorstep a few months after I came home from the forest. It was an infant then, and it butchered my parents. I found pieces of them around their cabin for years. It then proceeded to kill everyone related to me, but it wouldn't let me die or kill me, and I couldn't figure out why until I realized it needed me the way a parasite needs its host. Finally, when everyone I loved was dead and buried, it needed more prey. And it found you. It will take pieces of you, then keep you alive to take pieces of everyone you love. It will feed on your pain as you live through your own horror show. I swallowed hard. He had lost his damned mind, surely. What on earth was he trying to say? If I were you, I would take all my belongings and leave. Leave the state. Hell, leave the country. Don't ever look back, you hear me? Ever. With a sharp click, he hung up. I wish I had listened to him. I wish I hadn't decided that I needed to rescue my wife at any cost. Instead, I am sitting here in the dark inside the old cabin looking outside the window, my fingers folded around the hunting rifle. A sickle moon gleams silver, the only light in the jet-black night. And there inside the darkness, I think I see a figure shimmer. From a distance, she almost looks like my wife. Almost. Until her inhuman skeletal jaw distends, and she screams. I stopped in a small town while making a delivery. I shouldn't have listened to their folk tales. Every small town has their fair share of local legends. They don't really travel past the borders of the town, and most certainly never end up on the internet. Ironic, considering I'm writing this now, but the locals can tell them by heart. I've heard a lot of them in my time as a truck driver, but none of them actually held any truth to them. Except for one, the story of the ghoul. I heard it when I was traveling through South Dakota. I had stopped driving for the night as I was just too damn tired, and it was so humid out that my windshield started to fog up. I'd ended up in some tiny town called Aberrage, about an hour from Custer and 3 hours from where I needed to drop my shipment. When I say it was tiny, I mean it. There were about 15 buildings total, most of them houses. The remainder were a sole restaurant with a bar attached, one church, and a gas station. I didn't exactly trust the restaurant's quality, but I was starving, so I figured that I'd at least sit at the bar and order some sliders, if they had them. The door jingled as I walked in, and a mostly empty dining room greeted me. There were 3 total people in the building, from what I saw. There was the bartender, a bald-bearded man who immediately gave me a quizzical look. The only other person at the bar was a young woman who was drinking a labelless beer and didn't even turn her head to look at me when I sat down. I was clearly the outlier here. I wasn't exactly welcome, and I felt it. Still, I picked up a menu and tapped the beer I wanted. When I took my first sip, she finally spoke. I haven't seen you before. Her voice was equal parts rough and soothing. I was startled, but I pride myself on being polite, so I turned to face her and tried to make small talk. I'm not from around here. I'm just passing through. I figured, what brings you in here? The appetite of a fucking horse, that's what. I've been on the road for 11 hours. She giggled. She wasn't bad looking, but wasn't exactly my type either, so I hoped she wouldn't confuse my jokes as flirting. You're funny. I turned away for a moment to signal for another beer, then looked back at her. I have my moments, at least. She looked at the bartender as he passed me my second pour and waited for him to take my order before she signaled to him. "Rico, should we do it?" He grunted and walked into the kitchen. She seemed to take that as a yes and excitedly looked at me. "We've got a tradition around here. Everyone who drinks at the bar has to tell a story. It's nothing crazy, but we only have 23 people living here, so we're always itching to hear something new." I'm not a very interesting person, all things considered. You would think I had some crazy stories after traveling around the country, but I really never left the road long enough to see stuff like that. Still, I wanted to put on a good show, so I decided to tell them a story about the first time I saw the ocean. As I munched on my onion rings, I tried to make it as fantastical as possible, and admittedly embellished the details a bit. I'd never actually seen a killer whale before, but they didn't need to know that. By the looks of it, the woman was captivated with the story, and sat there the whole time with her chin in her hands and her bright eyes trained on mine. I finished spinning my tale and turned back to face the bar, placing a 20 on the counter as a tip. I was about to say goodbye when the woman halted me, with a slight smirk on her face. "You got a good speaking voice. Thanks for telling us your story. I want to tell you one too." I was dead tired, but my manners prevented me from refusing, so I smiled and signaled to her to continue. "It's the same one I tell everyone who comes through here, because it's the one that sticks with you the longest." I nearly jumped out of my chair when the bartender finally spoke. It wasn't even directed at me, but it caught me off guard. "The one about the ghoul again?" "Yes, sir, unless you got a better idea." He remained silent. She looked at me and began her story. The ghoul was a local ghost story about something that haunted people who passed through the town. It was a long, pale figure that would only speak one word at a time. It would start haunting someone once they heard its story, and wouldn't stop until they were dead. I sat there, relatively entertained as she described the ways that the ghoul would make people go missing, but I obviously wasn't buying it. "But you want to know how you can be sure that the ghoul is after you? How's that? It makes you see stuff, man. Stuff that isn't really there. It'll make you see it, feel like it's real." To me, this story just sounded like a bad drug trip, or an excuse to get me to stay in town. I was blinking in and out of consciousness when she finally finished, and decided I'd head back to the motel before she decided that story time would continue. "Well, I'm going to call it a night. You folks have a good one." She stopped smiling and just blankly stared at me. I got up and walked towards the door, pushing it open with my foot. "Hey, one question before you go." I sighed and turned around. I just wanted to go to bed. "Yeah, what's up? You can see me, right?" I wasn't sure if I'd heard her wrong, but what I'd heard was a weird-ass question indeed. Who was us? Her and the bartender? Of course I could see them. They were right there. She was starting to creep me out. Yeah?" She took a sip of her drink and looked at the bartender before turning back towards me. "Well, good night." My brow furrowed and I walked out the door. Whatever was going on with that woman, I wanted no part of it. She'd been pretty nice up to that point, too. I have no idea where all of that suddenly came from. I wasn't exactly in the mood to ponder it further, so I began walking down the street towards the motel. As I walked, I thought about the story she told me. Why was that the story she told to people who passed through town? Some sort of scare you into staying tactic, like I guessed, maybe? I wasn't sure. I unlocked the door to my room, and after brushing my teeth, tucked in for the night. I woke up to a knock at the door. I rubbed my eyes and groaned. I didn't feel well rested at all. I rolled over and grabbed my phone off the bedside table, squinting as the bright light hit my eyes. It was 3 in the morning. What someone could want at this hour, I had no idea, but I wasn't about to entertain it. I put my phone back and shut my eyes, hoping that whoever was there would go away. The second knock jolted out whatever grogginess I had left in my system. It was much louder than the last one, like someone had slapped the palm of their hand onto the door. I jumped out of the bed and laid on the floor, hoping that they wouldn't try the handle. I had to get to the door and lay against it. Whatever unsavory character was trying to open it was still pounding, and I didn't have confidence that the shitty motel door would hold. I crawled on my hands and knees to the other side of the room, and as my bare back pressed against the cool, scratched wood, the pounding suddenly stopped. I was horrified that I would hear the handle turn or feel the door give out from behind me after a kick, but none of that happened. Instead, I hear shuffling from behind the door, which gave way to a single word breaking the silence. Open. It was no louder than a whisper, but in the deafening silence, I heard it clearly. My heart sank, and I tried to process what I'd just heard. It didn't sound like anyone I knew, obviously, but it also didn't really sound either male or female. I tried my best not to move and held my breath. Please, open. Every hushed word pumped a dose of adrenaline directly into my system. Whoever was out there was either sincerely in need of help or trying to coax me to open the door so they could do God knows what. I had to stay put. If I went to grab my phone, I was afraid that the door would fly open and I'd have to face whoever it was. I sat there for what felt like hours. As I was starting to fall asleep again, much to my dismay, I heard footsteps walking away from the door. I inched away from the door as they got quieter and was almost at the bedside table when I looked up. The bathroom door, which was open before I went to bed, was now closed. I froze, unsure of what to do. When the pounding started from the other side of that door, I shot up, grabbed my phone and keys, and sprinted towards the bedroom door. As I flung the door open, I heard heavy footsteps not far behind me, along with the familiar voice, "No." It kept repeating it so calmly, following behind me. I bolted down the stairs, running through the parking lot towards my truck. As I jumped into the driver's seat, I felt something hit the door. I didn't want to turn. I didn't want to look. But I did. Standing outside of my door was a twisted face. The eyes were the size of baseballs and were peeled open, fixed directly on me. The mouth hung open, as if the jaw couldn't close at all. It didn't have a nose or ears or any other features on its face. We sat looking at each other for what was most likely seconds, but may as well have been eons. Without moving its gaping mouth, it spoke, "See? Me." By this point, I'd pieced together what was happening and jammed the keys into the ignition. I floored it onto the road and didn't breathe until the town was nothing but a faint light in the distance. I was exhausted and could barely keep my eyes open. I yawned and slapped myself on the cheek in an attempt to wake myself up, but could feel myself drifting off. But I was feeling something else too, a sense of dread right in the pit of my stomach. Taking my eyes off the road, I cautiously turned my head to the left. It was still there. Its head was directly centered in my window now, smiling at me. I swallowed the urge to scream and looked back at the road. It couldn't get in and couldn't affect me if I didn't look at it. But what it could do was talk. In its low, haunting voice punctuated with guttural growling, "You see me." It repeated that for hours. I'd almost forgotten what silence was like by the time the sun rose. As the dawn broke and the light began to fill my eyes once again, it went quiet and only the sound of my tires traversing the bumpy road remained. I looked to the left and saw trees through my window. Nothing was blocking it anymore. I arrived in Dupree shortly after and didn't even help the factory workers unload the shipment. I just sat in the driver's seat, smoking a cigarette and thinking to myself. When someone knocked on my window, I nearly had a heart attack. It was the factory supervisor, who I'd called to sign off on the product. "You doing okay? Couple of my guys said you didn't look so hot." I cleared my throat and put my cigarette out in the ashtray. I looked over at him and managed a smile. "Yeah, I'm all right. Long night, though. Barely got any sleep. Had to leave at 3 a.m. 3 in the morning? How far away were you that you just now got here?" I opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel, holding my clipboard. It felt good to make small talk after what I'd been through. "I was up in Aberage. Odd little town, for sure." "Aberage? I've never heard of it." I looked at him, expecting him to be kidding me. His brow was furrowed, and he looked concerned for me, if anything. I pulled out my phone and showed him my delivery tracking app, which had marked where I'd stopped for the night. "It's right about here." He looked away from the phone and at me, with serious concern on his face now. "I've been hunting out there, and I can tell you, there's nothing there but woods for miles, my friend." I first met my brother when I was 10. It was weird. One day I was an only child. The next I had an older brother. My parents didn't even warn me. Just one day he arrived and took my room, and I had to sleep in the basement. He arrived in a large waxed raincoat. I remember the water droplets that hung to its surface as he leaned over me and offered his hand. I ran behind my mother's legs and stayed there. He smiled back. My mother apologized for me, and that was that. It was obvious after a few days that he was their favorite. I had a lot of issues, and I knew I was a disappointment to them. I visited a therapist twice a week, though I didn't talk much. I never did. I think that was my main problem. I was fine. My parents thought otherwise. One day, my new brother came downstairs and handed me a used painting set and canvases. I ignored him, upset he'd usurped me. He didn't say anything, instead set up the easel and began to paint. He was incredible. I watched in awe as within minutes he had painted things I couldn't imagine were possible from a paintbrush. He finished with a painting of a door. It looked familiar, but I wasn't sure. He set down the paints and walked back upstairs. I stared at it for weeks. Then one day, I decided to try for myself. At first I was terrible, but as the months rolled on, I got better and better. I still didn't have the confidence to speak to my brother, but every now and then he'd make his way into the basement and look at what I'd painted. He'd stare at them with nostalgia in his eyes. He would cry. I, though, hid behind the sofa, watching him mentally critique my work. "Keep it up," he said in a hushed tone. The hairs on my neck stood up and I felt a warm glow around me, something I'd not felt before. So I continued to paint. By the time I was a teenager, my brother was around less and less, but my painting was as good as what his was when he first showed me. I really wanted him to see what I'd created. It was all because of him, after all. I waited one day, in the living room. I stole glances out of the window, waiting for him to come home. When he did, I jumped out of my chair and ran to the door to greet him. He stepped back, as if not wanting to embrace me. "Look at what I painted," I said to him. My parents appeared surprised. Even though I was 16, I rarely spoke. I ran to the basement door. "I think you should follow him," my mother said to my brother. I waited for what seemed like hours, until my brother walked down the stairs. I could barely see his face under the hood of his waxed jacket. "What do you think?" I offered. He stepped into the light, examining the painting. Tears rolled down his cheeks. I put my hand to my mouth. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, and he began to cry. Upset, I raced over to him and hugged him. "Thank you for teaching me," I said. I then felt his body sway. I tried to hold on to him, but my grasp wasn't strong enough. He collapsed, hitting his head on the side of my desk and onto the floor. The following months were the worst of my life. My brother was dead. With my mental history, I was sent to a psychiatric hospital. They said I had an episode and tried to kill my brother. I didn't. I swear. He fell. They said it may have been a side effect of the medication I was on, or my psychosis in general. After many sessions with the in-house psychiatrist, I was allowed access to painting material. To be honest, it wasn't that bad. I saw my parents once a week, and I was able to paint. I thought about my brother a lot. I thought about that painting he did for me, the one of the door. I tried my best to remember it, and over I tried to paint it. Each time I stood back and looked at it. Something wasn't right, and I never knew what. Until one day I got it spot on. That's when I realized what it was of. It was the front door of our house. Seeing it in front of me, it was so obvious. I peered at it from different angles. I remembered it all. I started to paint in all the little details. The room began to get cold, so I put on my jacket. I placed the paints in my pocket when I was done and gazed in awe. It was almost real. I stared and cried. I wasn't going to see this front door for a long time, if ever. That frightened me. The longer I gazed, the more I wished I could just be standing outside it, knocking on it, waiting for my parents to answer. I pretended I was standing outside. For the first time in months, I felt free. I imagined the wind blowing as the rains fell. I imagined reaching out to turn the handle. I closed my eyes and reached. I could feel the rain on my forehead. I could feel the cool air. I could hear the water slap against my jacket. I opened my eyes. I was there, outside my parents' house. I panicked briefly before, almost on autopilot, walking towards the door. I knocked. I felt I must be dreaming. Then the door opened. My mother stood there. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Mum, it's your son." She tried to close the door. I placed my foot in the way. "Please, just listen to me." She looked into my eyes. There was a recognition in them. She knew I was truthful. "Come on in," she said, confused. I saw a little boy in the living room. I knelt down to talk to him. He ran behind his mother's legs. I smiled, remembering myself doing that. I tapped my pocket, feeling the painting set in there. I knew what I needed to do. I made a deal with the devil and survived, or so I thought. I made a deal with the devil and kept my soul, but my deal might not be over like I thought. This is my story. I was once a dutiful soldier in a perpetual war that seemed never ending. I was always at the front line, taking big risks and never getting injured, gaining the nickname the Iron Man. But one day everything changed. A peace treaty was struck. Unfortunately, it came at a great cost. New political powers rose from the treaty. Soon our country was being run by figureheads who we once fought against. It seems they won the war, but with pen and paper. There was so much corruption in this new government, and the people had no more fight left in them to try to stop it. There was no money for veterans, no jobs for the lower classes, and no social assistance as the politicians were pocketing the country's money. I, along with the majority of the country, was having trouble finding work. I had no home and rarely had food. One day, I came upon an apple tree that stood at a crossroads. Being hungry, I went up to the tree and plucked an apple down from it. I sat down to enjoy this brief moment, hoping the apple would give me some strength to carry on to the next day. As I took my first bite, I noticed a dark shadow traveling along the ground, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I slowly lifted my head to see an eccentric-looking man standing before me. The strange man wore a green jacket and leaned on a golden walking stick adorned with sapphires. The man looked quite dignified, but then I realized he had goat hooves for feet. I jumped up out of fright, dropping the apple as I stared down at the goat hooves. I went to grab my rifle from my back when the strange man started to speak. "I know what you are in need of," said the man. I stood there frozen for a moment. Out of curiosity more than anything, I stopped to listen to what this strange man had to say. The man in the green jacket leaned forward on his walking stick and smirked as he continued to speak. "I will give you money and property, as much as you can squander away in your lifetime." I shook my head as I tried to make sense of this situation, stammering in response. "Who? What? What are you talking about?" The man in the green jacket ignored my questions and continued. "However," he paused for a moment to add some sort of flair for the dramatic, waiting to see if I flinched at his words. "Before I give you everything your heart desires, I must know if you are fearless. I don't want to be giving away my money to a coward." The strange man questioning my bravery got my attention right quick, and I snapped back at him. "A soldier and fear. How can those go together? I can handle any test of bravery." The man grinned wide and answered, "Very well, look behind you." I turned around and suddenly a large, growling bear with red eyes appeared, barreling towards me. I shouted for a moment out of surprise, confused where this bear came from. But quickly my training kicked in, and I grabbed my rifle and aimed. The man must have seen the smile on my face as I took aim and shot the bear in the snout. It fell down motionless. The strange man grinned ear to ear and said, "Very good. You do not lack courage, but there is one more condition that you will have to fulfill." I was beginning to put together who this man was. The goat feet, the sudden appearance of a bear right on cue, and now he wants to make a deal? I realized I must be talking to a demon or the devil himself, so I quickly interrupted to make a counteroffer. Standing tall, I spoke with conviction. "As long as I can keep my soul in salvation, then I will consider your offer. Otherwise, I'll have nothing to do with it." The devil's face became emotionless as he leaned in closer, inspecting me up and down, taking a long whiff of me, as if I was some meal. He spun around and began to pace slowly, playfully whirling his walking stick around. The man came across as some kind of demonic circus ringleader with the way he moved and spoke. His face went from emotionless to uncanny as he smirked and began to speak. "A counteroffer? How intriguing!" The devil grinned and stared me in the eyes, as if trying to dig a hole into my soul. This clearly was a fun game for him, and he was playing with me like a cat plays with its prey. He continued, "How about this then? For the next 7 years you are neither to wash yourself, nor comb your hair, nor cut your nails, nor pray. I will give you a jacket and a cloak which you must wear. If you die during these 7 years, you are mine. If you stay alive, you are free, and I will bestow all the riches upon you to last a lifetime." I pondered for a moment, thinking about how desperate I had been the past few months, and I thought about how many times I had faced death in the war and survived. I was the Iron Man after all. I decided the odds would be in my favor. I nodded at him and said, "All right, you have a deal." The devil held out his hand. I leaned in, pausing for a moment, wondering if this was a mistake. But quickly he grasped my hand, and that was that. The deal was done. The devil took off his green jacket and gave it to me, saying, "Whenever you wear this jacket and reach into its pocket, you will find a handful of money." Then he walked over to the dead bear, and with a burning hand ripped off its pelt, transforming it into a cloak. He wrapped it around my shoulders and said, "This shall be your cloak, and your bed as well. You are to sleep on it, and you are not allowed to lie in any other bed." The devil grabbed my jacket and put it on himself as if it was some sort of symbol of the deal. He smiled at me, and with a malicious tone he told me another condition. "One last thing. Your name for these next 7 years will be Bearskin. That is the name you will go by, no exceptions." I furrowed my brow and began to walk up to him in protest. "Wait a minute, you keep adding things to this deal." But my protest was without merit, as the devil smirked, turned, and disappeared right before my eyes. I sighed and mumbled under my breath, "Bearskin? What a stupid name." I then shoved my hands into the pockets of the green jacket and found that the promise was true. I felt piles of paper inside and pulled out a handful of them to see dozens of $100 bills. I gasped for a moment. Part of me thought this whole exchange was some kind of hunger-induced delusion. But no, I really did just enter a deal with the devil for my soul. What did I do? I cried out to myself. But it was too late. The deal was struck. I decided that I had to play the devil at his game. I would keep my soul pure and not let money taint it. I began to travel so I could do good in the world. I didn't buy any material things for myself, only basic food and shelter, and I gave money to others in need. I didn't want to get comfortable at any one location, so I stayed at hostels, shelters, or cheap motels. I figured if I did good deeds, my soul would stay clean, and if I kept on the move, I would have a better chance of surviving. The first 2 years, my appearance went from okay to somewhat acceptable. By year 3, I smelled like a rotting corpse, and I looked like some kind of cryptid bear person. I was covered in dirt, hair was overgrown and matted, and my nails were long and curling. I was a mess, and it was getting harder to be accepted around the general populace. Everyone who saw me ran away. But because I gave back to others, I was always able to get by and find some lodging and food. This was a 7-year war that I was determined to win. In the 4th year, I arrived at a growing town in the east. The only option for lodging was a motel that was being renovated. Half the rooms were still run down and unsafe. The owner would not let me rent a room, though. He told me it was because I would scare away patrons. So I reached into both pockets and pulled out piles of money for him, throwing it on the counter. The owner's eyes grew wide, and he agreed to let me stay, but only in one of the dilapidated rooms. I also had to promise not to let myself be seen, saying he would evict me if I scared away patrons. One evening, as I sat on the dingy bed, I began daydreaming about my future when I heard a loud sobbing in a nearby room. I had to stick to the plan. I had to help those in need. I decided to risk being seen, and I knocked on their door. An old man answered, his cheeks tear-stained, and the sound of his sobs still lingered. As he saw me, he jumped out of fear and was about to run away when I spoke. It seemed that a human voice coming from my tussle of hair and dirt made the old man curious, so he stopped to listen. I asked the old man, "What is wrong? Why all the tears?" The old man went on to explain his story. He recently lost all his money in a business deal. He even lost his house. The motel was the only place he could afford to keep a roof over the heads of his daughters and himself, and they barely had one meal a day to split between them. The motel being upgraded meant the new owner wanted them out, as they couldn't afford the upgraded rooms. The new owner threatened to call the police to have them arrested if they did not pay up or leave. I smiled at the old man and put my hand into the green jacket pocket. "If that is your only problem, I have money," I said as I handed him handfuls of bills. "Take it, get back on your feet, and help your family." The old man's eyes began to swell up as he softly cried tears of happiness. He smiled up at me and said, "Thank you for your generosity. Please come to dinner tonight with my family so I can repay your kindness with all I have to offer, my time and appreciation." I smiled and nodded to the old man, accepting his invitation. When dinner time approached, I knocked on his door. The old man answered, inviting me inside while saying, "I told my daughters what you have done to help us. They are all so thankful and looking forward to meeting you." I followed the old man into the little kitchenette. Just as he was about to introduce me to his daughters, one of them screamed out of fright and ran out of the room. For a moment, I forgot what I looked like. That scream reminded me again that people see me as a monster. I hung my head down and told the old man, "I frighten people when I don't mean to. I will head back to my room." I started to turn around to leave when another one of his daughters called out to me, "Wait, please don't go. What you did for us, and we are strangers to you. Clearly you are not a monster, and we want to repay your kindness. Please have a seat. We want you to stay." She stood there smiling kindly. Her eyes held a pure sincerity in them. Her words and demeanor relaxed me, and I took a seat at the table with the old man and the two remaining daughters. The kind-hearted daughter smiled as she passed me some food. "My name is Adriana," she said. I mumbled back, "My name is Bearskin." The other daughter at the table began to chuckle. She had been staring at me with a look of confusion. She scoffed and began her barrage of questions. "Who would name their child that? How do you even have money? Why don't you get yourself cleaned up? You look like an animal." The old man shot his daughter a look of disapproval as he shushed her. "Quiet you." The old man looked back at me and said, "I'm sorry she can be incredibly blunt and doesn't know how to be tactful with her words." His daughter folded her arms across her chest and began to pout. "Daddy, I'm just an honest person. I don't see the point in lying." I looked over at her and nodded my head in response. Honesty can be very hard to come by. There are so many corrupt people in the world. It's nice to meet someone who has the ability to tell it like it is. She smiled at my response. We continued idle conversation as we finished the rest of the evening's meal. Their family won my heart that night, and I ended up spending the next year in that town. During that year, I helped them get situated into a home, get the father's business back, and pretty much became a part of the family. I had become especially close with Adriana. She was a very kind soul and was determined to repay my kindness with her company. As we spent more time together, I found myself starting to have romantic feelings for her. After 5 years of living with this deal, I decided to just be spontaneous. We were having a picnic at a nearby pond, enjoying the scenery when I just blurted it out, "Adriana, would you consider marrying me?" I know it was a huge leap to ask her to marry me when I looked like this, but after the way my life had gone over the last 5 years, I figured I would just take a shot at happiness. I have been dealing with rejection and disgust this whole time, so I could easily handle it if she said no. Adriana sat up and moved her hands to grab mine. Even though they were in a disgusting state, she didn't seem to care. She smiled up at me and surprisingly responded, "Yes, that would be lovely. There is so much bad in this world. I know you are a good man and you truly care about my family." I smiled and pulled an old ring off one of my fingers, snapping it in half. As I tried to explain my one caveat, I still have to complete this journey I am on. It is difficult for me to explain why, but I must leave for a bit to finish this. She looked up at me concerned. "How long will you be gone?" I shook my head and told her, "I have 2 more years left. If you are okay with waiting, I want you to keep half of this ring and I'll keep the other half. When I get back, I will get you a proper ring." She began to cry softly. I wrapped my arms around her and told her, "I must go help more people. I have a situation hanging over my head and I don't want you or your family to get hurt. I promise I will tell you everything if I return. If I do not return after 2 years, then it is because I have died." She nodded, continuing to cry, but took the half-piece of ring. I traveled the country for the next 2 years, doing good wherever I could. Finally, the last day of my 7 years came around. So at dawn, I went back to the apple tree at the crossroad and waited for the devil to show up. Fairly quickly, the wind began to howl, and the shadow fell across the road again. I looked up to see the devil scowling angrily at me. He threw my old jacket at me and demanded the return of his green jacket. I stood tall, proud of surviving the last 7 years and doing good all along the way. I held up a finger up to the devil as I made my demands. Now hold on, we haven't finalized our deal yet. You added more to the deal without giving me a chance to counter last time, so my final demand is, you have to clean me up. Take the last 7 years of filth and growth and make me look as I was. The devil scowled and raised his hand up, snapping his fingers, and suddenly I was back to looking like myself again. My skin was clean, hair and nails trimmed, and clothing was fresh. I looked even better than I had before. Now, you owe me my riches, I announced to the devil. The devil grit his teeth at me and reluctantly snapped his fingers as he said, "There! Now your jacket will always provide you with the same wealth as my green jacket did before." He then snatched up the green jacket, and in an instant, he disappeared. Seeing the demon gone, I smiled and let out a breath of relief. Finally, my life is my own again, I said to myself as I walked away from the crossroads for the last time. I quickly traveled back to the town where Adriana was, hoping with all hope that she would still be there waiting for me. When I knocked on the door, I looked so different from before that no one recognized me. The old man thought I was a businessman and invited me inside. I sat down with the family, and the 2 other daughters began to fawn over me. They started pouring me wine, serving me food, and doing everything to try and vie for my attention. Adriana, however, would not raise her eyes to look at me and did not speak a word. She was dressed all in black, and that's when I realized she thought I was dead. The father began conversation, assuming I was there to discuss a business opportunity. But I interrupted him and told him, "Oh no, I am here to get my bride so we can get married." When the 2 other sisters heard this, they jumped up and ran into their bedrooms to put on some fancy dresses. Apparently each of them thought that I was here to arrange a marriage and that they may be chosen as a bride. Their father went to the kitchen to grab more wine to celebrate. As soon as I was alone with Adriana, I brought out my half of the ring and dropped it into a glass of wine, which I handed to her. She took the wine and began to sip on it. Seeing the half ring in her glass, her face changed and she began to smile. She took her half, which she wore on a ribbon around her neck, put them together, and saw that the 2 pieces matched perfectly. I smiled and said, "It's nice to finally meet you, Adriana. My name is Jacob. The journey is finally over." She smiled wide and stood up, embracing me, and we kissed. In the meantime, the 2 sisters came back, beautifully dressed, their hair and makeup done just right. When they saw Adriana and I kissing, they began to fume and cry. The brutally honest sister's eyes seemed to flash red, and she walked out of the room for a moment. Her walk seemed off, like a marionette being controlled by strings. I felt the air in the room shift. Something was wrong. I looked around the room, trying to figure out what was going on, when suddenly Adriana's sister came running back in, screaming with a knife in her hand. I couldn't stop her in time, and she began attacking Adriana with quick movements, over and over. A scuffle ensued, and I pulled her off Adriana, throwing her against a wall, knocking her unconscious. But it was too late. I scooped up Adriana. She had lost so much blood. It was everywhere. So much damage in only a few seconds. I yelled at the other sister to call for help. She got so scared she ran out of the house. The father came running into the room after hearing all the screaming. Upon seeing the bloody mess and his daughter laying there lifeless, he began to clutch at his chest as he too fell to the ground. I felt like I was in some weird fever dream, surrounded by death. I ran to the phone to call for help. As I was speaking with emergency services, I heard Adriana's sister wake up and start screaming, "What did I do?" I ran back into the room to try and subdue her until the police showed up, but she saw me, panicked, and ran out the front door. I ran after her, but couldn't catch up. I had to watch as she frantically ran into the road and straight into traffic, when suddenly a large truck appeared out of nowhere, slamming into her. I stood outside for a moment in complete shock of everything that I just witnessed. Then suddenly I felt a cool chill, the hair raising on the back of my neck as I watched a shadow crawl along the ground, the familiar shadow as I had seen 2 times before. I turned around to go back into the house, but there he was, leaning on his walking stick, grinning at me, the green jacket and goat feet, mocking me. I became red with anger and began to yell at him. "What did you do?" The devil leaned in close, growling out to me. "Can't you see? I now have 3 souls instead of just your one." He then disappeared in the blink of an eye. I lost the love of my life that day and remained forever scarred. 3 people died and their souls damned, all because I made a selfish deal. I never forgot their faces. 10 years have passed, and yet I recognized her like it was yesterday. The sister who ran away, I saw her standing outside my apartment last night, and she was wearing a green jacket, that familiar jacket. I thought I escaped with just heartbreak, but it would seem there is no true escape from the devil. I'm not sure what kind of deal she made. This is why I am currently recording my story. I don't know what will come of me tomorrow. This might be my end.